Hey all, Scott here. Have you ever thought about how even after 9 years, FNAF has never had to dive into real-world issues while also conveying heavy plot points? Yeah, me too. I'm glad that hasn't happened yet. Holy shit, never mind. Odds are, if you've been around long enough, you've seen this brown bear before. No, not that one. This one. GRIZZLY'S has definitely made its rounds throughout the community for its incredibly odd story direction. It's more so known as the political fangame due to its random jabs at the political system in the US, which is an odd choice for a FNAF fangame story. I really wish I was joking. With a concept like that, I was all on board. I mean, how could a concept that is so inherently goofy like that be turned into a fangame? Well, I was asking the same question weeks ago. You know, back when I was still sane. Unsurprisingly, a lot of people have asked the same questions about GRIZZLY'S, saying that it seemed like a way for the creator to vent his political beliefs. Hearing this, I was more interested than ever, so I did a bunch of research on the series and its creator to really get to the bottom of this, and what I found was, well, it was something. I played through every single GRIZZLY'S game to see what all the fuss was about, but before we get into it, I must warn you, it takes guts. I actually had a lot of help from the game's developer, Lester Tellez, so if it weren't for him, this video wouldn't have happened. From 2 separate remakes, a VR installment, and even to a sequel game in the works, the GRIZZLY'S chronology has undoubtedly gone through a lot of development. So join me as we go through everything this strange series has to offer. Crazy enough, GRIZZLY'S first appearance wasn't in a GRIZZLY'S game. Instead, this other game called Devious Minds. It was still developed by Lester, but this game is so different from GRIZZLY'S, I debated even talking about it. But since I'm doing the entire series, I felt that including the game that started it all is worth mentioning. Devious Minds takes place at Gordon's Robotics Incorporated, where we just got the job watching over the place at night. There are very few similarities to GRIZZLY'S, but the primary one is that GRIZZLY is one of the threats. Other than that, the story is completely different from the one told in GRIZZLY'S. Again, really debated even including this one because it's not at all that important to the story of GRIZZLY'S, but at least you know it existed. Well, here it is, GRIZZLY'S. When I first opened the game, I was hit with the menu music, and my only real thought was, this doesn't fit. But the more I think about it, it fits only because the game is so incredibly random. Something as minor as the menu music choice really doesn't even seem that crazy. Oh yeah, randomness is a common theme in GRIZZLY'S. Loading into the actual game, there's a couple things I want to talk about immediately. First of which is this weird ass scrolling. I don't know what it is, but this scrolling is just too sensitive for my liking. Anyway, we get a phone call from our friend Tyler, who's concerned after our recent breakup that we had. I do not care about the story implications here. This call is so funny out of context.
John, if she really loved you,
What the fuck are you guys talking about?
The only character active on night 1 is GRIZZLY, and he'll wander through the halls until he ends up at one of the 2 doors. All you have to do is shut the door using the handle. I also want to take a moment to mention how terrible the door hitboxes are. Paired with the scrolling, I had a hard time finding where I was supposed to click. Especially with a certain character in the later nights, this was terrible. You really need to be able to accurately find and close the door, especially when the skill required gets higher each night. That was my only real complaint of the main nights though. The office looks great and I love the ambience, even when you can hear it loop. A detail I found really neat was the clock in the office. I always love when fangames take parts of the normal UI and implement them in smart ways into the environment. The clock is no exception here, seriously good stuff. After finishing night 1, a small cutscene plays showing GRIZZLY in this weird N64 style logging onto a computer installed with GRIZZOS, my favorite. The scene goes black and we can see GRIZZLY'S eyes just out of the darkness before the cutscene ends. These analog styled cutscenes are a staple of the GRIZZLY'S series and they'll continue to make an appearance every night. Night 2 kicks off with arguably one of the best phone calls of all time. John's friend Earl calls, talking to John about an incident they had with a friend that landed one of them in the hospital. John uses this opportunity to mention his dissatisfaction with the country. They then talk about how it's election year, but John won't vote because the elections were rigged. John proceeds to go on a 30-second ramble about elections and electoral votes and how the whole system is rigged. I can't, this game is too much. Anyway, GRIZZLY is still the only character active, but its AI has increased a little bit. There is genuinely nothing else to note for night 2, but that's okay, because I spent that entire time wondering what I had just listened to. Finishing off night 2 and seeing the VHS tape doesn't help either. It's your standard analog horror tape with loud noises and plenty of jump scares. Night 3 though, some stuff actually happens. We get a phone call from a mysterious person. They claim they know who we are. The person on the other end tells us that the government is after us for some reason, and it takes guts to do what he's about to do. Alright, let's address the gut-sized elephant in the room. It takes guts is a line from the game that gets repeated way too much. To be honest, it's actually kind of funny hearing it in game. For this reason, we'll be counting every time "it takes guts" is said. On night 3, we are also introduced to 2 new characters. The prototype, who is this game's Foxy replacement, will run down the right hall and needs to be stopped when you hear his audio cue. The other character is Silly Willy, who, might I add, has the funniest name I've ever heard for a character. Like, I'm sorry, how are you supposed to get behind Silly Willy? Anyway, he's pretty much like Grizzly, but he will only come down the middle hallway. Both of these new characters definitely spice up the gameplay loop in a nice way, as there's more to worry about other than Grizzly. I also want to point out that these are the 2 final characters added, and there still isn't a use for the cameras. There's actually a separate character who I haven't even mentioned yet that can affect you through the cameras, so for the entire game they are pretty much irrelevant. Since the gameplay loop is pretty much the exact same here on out, I'm gonna spare you boring details of each night and just summarize the rest of the game. Got it? Cool. Night 3's VHS tape features Grizzly, but spooky. Also, another "it takes guts," put it on the board. Night 4, John's mother calls asking where he is and why he hasn't come home. John says that he ran away from them for a reason. Some of the dialogue possibly alludes to John's father abusing him while growing up. I actually did put in my notes that the gameplay speeds up tremendously on Night 4, and that I almost died in the first 30 seconds. So there's that. Night 4's VHS tape is a little interesting. It depicts John's girlfriend leaving him, claiming that he spends too much time working on the Grizzly robot. It then cuts to Grizzly seemingly hunting her down. Yeah, I really don't understand what's going on here. On Night 5, John gets a phone call from the fucking president. Yep, let's all take a breather and let that one sink in. He calls John to try and discredit what he's been saying about him over the previous nights. He tries to convince John that he doesn't stuff ballots and he knows what John did. Another "it takes guts" later, and the president says that he'll be at Grizzly's at 6 a.m. It's then implied through the VHS tape after that the president straight up murdered John. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I got from it. Surprisingly, that's really it for GRIZZLY'S. There are some more cutscenes that further push the story, but I think this is a game that you should actually play, so I'm not going to get into that. Seriously though, I really enjoyed my experience with GRIZZLY'S. As much as I shat on some things here and there, I do think this is one of the strongest FNAF games from pretty much every standpoint, except gameplay. The series only increases in quality from here. Shortly after the launch and sudden gain in popularity, Lester started to update the assets on the game page. No one thought much of the changes as they just looked like re-renders, but we wouldn't have to wait long for Lester to make the official announcement that GRIZZLY'S was getting an official remaster, titling it GRIZZLY'S Update 2022. And just like that, GRIZZLY'S news was coming at a frequent pace. New renders of what seemed to be new models of the game's characters surfaced, and from what it seemed, all hands were on deck for this official remaster. Not even 2 weeks passed until we got our first actual glimpse of the game's improvements, via the GRIZZLY'S teaser trailer. While not too much, we did get to see the new Grizzly model in action, and oh boy, better lighting! In all seriousness, the teaser maintained the analog tape feel that had at this point been made a staple for the series, while still feeling pretty new and refreshing. Lester knew that making a convincing analog-style tape is incredibly difficult, so he brought on Baddington, who was infamous for their analog horror tapes. I personally believe that bringing on some new faces like Baddington really helped sold the concept to a lot of people who were skeptical after the first game. And I mean, the support was really there as people started noticing the vast differences. Not only in the visuals, but the overall tone. I mean, this teaser was really the first time that I can safely say that GRIZZLY'S and horror even belonged in the same sentence. July 2022 was the perfect time to be a GRIZZLY'S fan. From the overabundance of GRIZZLY'S Remastered and GRIZZLY'S 2 teasers, which we'll talk about later, it was clear that the small team Lester had built was driven to push GRIZZLY'S along. Not even 5 days after the original GRIZZLY'S teaser trailer would Lester drop the full trailer, and my god did it look incredible. The trailer starts out with an animation of GRIZZLY reaching out while playing a song. Do I even need to say anything about the animation at this point? I think it'd just be a given that it looks so much better. One of the things I really enjoyed from this trailer was its emphasis on its story. I think we can all say with confidence that the way GRIZZLY'S story was presented in the original game made it seem more goofy and lighthearted than it needed to be. But now it seems like there was actual care and thought put into making the story make sense and feel not like a shitpost. Speaking of improvements, we finally got our first look at the newly improved gameplay. Take it as you will, I think this is a vast improvement from the original Office. I mean, do you know how sensitive the scrolling was? From what I could see, my issues with the odd perspective and hypersensitive scrolling seem to have been fixed, which is a more than welcome change. About halfway through the trailer, the eerie tone crosses into more horror territory. After the trailer released and all was said and done, that's all we would hear for the GRIZZLY'S remaster. Sure, we did get a couple of updates here and there confirming that yes, indeed, it was still in development, but that's the extent of what we got for a long time. So what happened? The team was working at such a rapid pace for weeks, and then just silence. Was it done? Were they waiting for a specific date to launch the game? These were the questions that a large portion of the fanbase were asking. With the turn of the new year, the update would be called GRIZZLY'S Update 2023. Which, although seemed promising at first, later turned sour with the fact that there weren't many updates following this. Finally, in mid-March of 2023, Lester confirmed that the game had entered the beta testing stage after nearly 8 months of development hell. Although we can't say for sure what was going on during those 8 months, we can say that we were finally about to play the GRIZZLY'S remaster. But as soon as we got this news, everything went silent. What happened? Well, I believe it to be because of a little thing called GRIZZLY'S VR. In late September of 2022, Lester announced that he would be partnering up with Euro to create a GRIZZLY'S virtual reality experience. As soon as I heard about this, I just knew it had potential to be really good. GRIZZLY'S main gameplay sections are set up in a way that would translate perfectly to VR. There's barely any movement in the office aside from looking back and forth, and to top it all off, the environments themselves would be way scarier. To say that I was hyped was a bit of an understatement. One problem: I don't own a VR. Well, didn't. But we'll get there. One of the many things that separated GRIZZLY'S VR from both GRIZZLY'S and its subsequent remaster was that its lore was told through VHS tapes instead of the goofy phone calls each night. We'll talk about this more in detail later on, but these VHS tapes were to be animated by Spectre, an animator who specializes in analog horror tapes. You might have seen their work recently blow up, for good reason too. The reception for GRIZZLY'S VR was overwhelmingly positive. From all corners of the community, people were coming together to see what this was all about. And as soon as it was announced, nothing. Lester and Euro made small updates showing their progress here and there, but that was pretty much it. There was one trailer which did showcase some gameplay, but aside from that, the marketing for GRIZZLY'S VR was pretty much non-existent. However, on May 5th, we did get a small cinematic teaser trailer with a June 25th release. But wait, isn't that today? Well, yes. A couple months back, in late April, Lester actually reached out to me and asked if I wanted to play GRIZZLY'S VR, to which I responded no. I didn't own a VR, and I really didn't feel like buying one to play GRIZZLY'S VR of all games. And that's where my involvement with GRIZZLY'S ended for a bit. Over the following weeks, Lester would send me unreleased footage and screenshots of the game to get my feedback, and while it looked great, I couldn't help but feel a little bad. I mean, this guy was sharing his work with me for the past few months, and I didn't even have the means to help support. So I did the very responsible thing and purchased a VR. I actually bought it for Help Wanted 2, which was announced a little earlier, but it's way funnier to say that I bought a VR for GRIZZLY'S. Anyway, with VR in hand, Lester sent me an early copy of GRIZZLY'S VR. Loading into the game was an absolute nightmare. This was my first time using a VR, let alone Steam VR. And trust me, the setup process is way more involved than it needed to be. Like seriously, it took me at least an hour to set up all the software, only for me to find out that I didn't have the right cable. So after 2 days of waiting for the right cable to arrive, I found out pretty early on that my PC couldn't handle the game. Playing the game normally was fine, albeit a bit laggy. However, the second I started recording, all hell broke loose. It would be nearly 10 plus seconds before the game would change frames. Out of options, I asked my sister if I could use her much better computer to play GRIZZLY'S. To which she said yes. So after another hour of installing software, I could finally play GRIZZLY'S VR. Loading into the game, we're standing in front of an old television with the game's warnings printed on it. The game actually asks us to sit down while playing, which I thought was pretty neat. Looking up, the GRIZZLY'S logo can be seen, providing the only light in the area aside from the TV. The main functions of the game are actually conveyed through VHS tapes, which we need to insert into the television. This ranges from stuff like the settings, credits, main nights, and even bonus tapes that we can unlock. I really like this choice as it makes the game feel more interactive instead of having us push buttons. Maybe this is the standard for VR games, I wouldn't know, since this was literally my first ever game I played in VR. With only one real task to do, we insert the night 1 tape into the television and begin our first shift. Loading into the office, we can already notice a few changes from the original GRIZZLY'S. Most importantly, the layout of the office has been switched to make it easier for us to pull the doors shut. The desk was moved to the corner of the room, which I thought was interesting. It definitely took some getting used to, especially trying to find where our location was on the map in real space. Secondly, the environments are terrifying. I don't think I can describe to you how creepy the game is in VR. I mean, you really have to play the game for yourself to make that judgment. We also got a phone call welcoming us to GRIZZLY'S. This phone guy is completely different from the one in the original GRIZZLY'S and serves more as a tutorial for the player than an actual lore drop. The phone guy gives us the basic rundown of guarding the restaurant. The typical close the doors only when you have to and preserve your power. However, I didn't actually learn until much later on that you can actually turn off the television in front of you. I kept it on at all times and it was just eating away at my power. I actually had to ask Lester why the power was running so fast a couple of times until I learned this. But I wish it was explained better. On the first night there are only 2 characters active. Grizzly, who will wander down any hall into your room, and the rabbits, who can mess with your cameras and even take away your door levers. Although the first night is usually a tutorial into the characters and their mechanics, I found it to be a nice challenge of sorts. Grizzly is super active right from the start and wastes no time getting to your office. When he inevitably does, reaching out and grabbing the door handle just to shut it is one of the most tense experiences I've ever had. I mean, the dude just comes out of the darkness and just stands there, which is creepy on its own, but in VR it's a whole different story. Considering how far you have to reach to shut the door, I was on edge the entire night. One of my favorite details from the office segments is how the cameras can be controlled like different channels on the television. Flipping through the different cameras is very reminiscent to how you would flip through the channels on an older television. This definitely took a little getting used to, considering that the flip is a little sensitive, but it definitely feels good to use and felt like I was operating an older television. Aside from reaching out every so often, night 1 isn't so bad. Upon returning to the menu, Grizzly is actually now standing in front of us along with the rabbits. This legitimately startled me. I mean, having Grizzly stand there is super cool, but it was a surprise I was not ready for. Especially with how on edge I was for the entire first night. After beating night 1, we unlocked 2 new tapes on the desk. The first is just for night 2, while the second has a scratched out name. Putting that one into the TV, a tape plays. It is a little long, so I'll do my best to paraphrase what happens. John can be seen cowering behind the desk in the Grizzly's office. He hears footsteps approaching from down the hall, when all of a sudden Grizzly shows up at the door. He briefly rambles about how John is so fragile and how he could easily crush him, but he quickly stops himself by saying that John is his pride and joy. He then asks John if he's his pride and joy, to which John is confused. Grizzly didn't like that and screams while John closes the door. John cries, realizing he's created a monster he cannot destroy. And that's it for the first tape. The only other thing to do is go into night 2. There are differences from night 1. For starters, Silly Willy is active. For some reason, he also got a rename. He now goes more simply by The Clown. The Clown has roughly the same attack pattern as Grizzly, going down either hall and showing up at the door. However, unlike Grizzly, he plays a small clown audio cue whenever he's in the hallway. The second active character is Prototype, who got a serious glow up compared to the original game. He actually has a face now, which is super neat to see. His mechanic is the exact same as it was in the original game, however he can go down either hallway. We need to look through the cameras to find which hallway he's standing in. This is all the first game needed. Just give the player a reason to check the cameras. Arguably one of the main differences between night 1 and 2 is the phone call we received at the start of the night. As you may know, the GRIZZLY'S VR VHS tapes were animated by Spectre. He also made a full VHS tape compilation on his channel, which explains every tape. In between those are segments of this guy talking. This is who gives the night 2 phone call. I really wish I understood the story better to try to describe him, but unfortunately all I can say is that he has a very wacky hairline. After completing the second night, you unlock the second tape, which reveals John attempting to dismantle Grizzly. The third night is the final main night of GRIZZLY'S VR. In it, quite literally nothing changes from night 2, except for a difficulty increase. Night 3 genuinely took me a while to beat because I kept running out of power. That was until I developed a strategy. You see, just like GRIZZLY'S, the cameras should be used as minimally as possible. I would only turn on the cameras every 30 or so seconds to find which hallway Prototype was in. Other than that, looking back and forth listening for audio cues was the way to go. This strategy made night 3 and even the secret 420 night way easier. I often get these 2 nights confused because they are relatively similar from a gameplay standpoint. Beating these 2 nights unlocks the 2 final VHS tapes. In tape number 3, we finally witness the murder that the series has been building up to. This is the origin of It Takes Guts. Of course, I can't show the full thing in this video, but man, they really don't hold back showing detail. The 420 mode tape, however, is truly something. It starts off the same way as the night 1 tape, but instead John stands up to Grizzly, telling him that he's been brought down a terrible path because of him. Then John proceeds to run and grab a flamethrower and melt every animatronic. Let's take a moment to breathe here. The power goes out, and as John turns it back on, Grizzly takes hold of the flamethrower and tries to kill John. John quickly runs back inside the office and grabs a grenade inside his desk and throws it at Grizzly. Oh boy, that was a lot. I like this ending way more than the ending in the original game. It actually ties the story together and gives us a satisfying conclusion to this main story. Who knows if any of this is canon, but I'm sure it'll hold some importance later down the line. Aside from that, that's it for GRIZZLY'S VR. I must say, this was a great experience. Playing a game like GRIZZLY'S in VR is really fun and actually adds to the horror that the first game was lacking. Not to mention how both the gameplay and story were improved dramatically between games. Seriously, I couldn't recommend this one enough. We only have one more part of the GRIZZLY'S series left to talk about, so let's talk about GRIZZLY'S 2 for a moment. At the moment, GRIZZLY'S 2 is still in development, so there isn't a whole lot of information I can provide right now. But from what I can say, the game seems to take place after the events of the first game. All of the characters have been sent to a warehouse, while you'll also have to fend off some new enemies as well. It also seems like the development team behind GRIZZLY'S 2 is putting a lot of effort into the game to make it super polished. I would be surprised if it even released anytime in the near future. And that's all there really is for GRIZZLY'S at the moment. You know, going into this, I was expecting the worst. Like seriously, if you were to tell me that a Fangame that's entire premise was politics turned out to be any good, I just wouldn't believe you. GRIZZLY'S was a pleasant surprise, blending everything I love about FNAF all into one cohesive game. It's far from perfect, but it's still great. You best believe that I will be playing GRIZZLY'S 2 when it releases. Well, that's it from me. Go play GRIZZLY'S VR.